Ngā mihi Joanna. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko moke tapu te maunga, ko hoere te awa, ko kura haupo te waka, ko te hora te marae, ko Ngāti Kuia, rāua ko Rangitāne o Wairau Oku Iwi, ko Liana MacDonald ahau. As Joanna mentioned, my presentation is based on some work I did as a postdoctoral research fellow for Joanna and Vincent's Marsden, he taonga te wariwari. And I will, begin. So in September 2019, I was lucky to spend the day observing a Pākehā museum educator, Janine, as she took a group of Year 13 history students from a neighbouring college to 6 sites associated with the New Zealand Wars in the Waipa district. The day in question was 1 week after the government's announcement that history would be a core component of the New Zealand curriculum by 2022, which became 2023. As we know, the New Zealand Wars evokes a range of feelings about our colonial history, some of which are particularly hard and messy for Pākehā, who are the descendants of the settler colonisers. And this consideration was clearly evident through the way that Janine approached the 1864 invasion of Rangiaowhia on the field trip. She was sensitive to the difficult emotions that the students would experience, yet she didn't shy away from the horrors that were inflicted upon Ngāti Apakura by colonial forces. But in order to honour the perspectives of Ngāti Apakura and to ensure that students didn't just hear the narratives but were really listening, Janine had to be strategic and work with the difficult emotions that the students would have been experiencing on the field trip. In my part of the presentation here, I'd like to take you through some of the key moments of the field trip that show how Janine did this. So I've missed over that. So the day started in an upper level of the museum that looks a bit like a performance space. The students are seated on 4 tiers looking down on Janine and a screen with a projected PowerPoint. The atmosphere was really relaxed, even as Janine says, "You'll experience difficult emotions today." And then she sets the scene for the upcoming field trip with some historical context about the Treaty of Waitangi and the Waikato Wars. There's quite a bit of low-key muttering among the students that slowly fizzles out. One-word answers eventually turn into sentences as Janine uses both humour and questions to get the students' attention. "What was the problem with the treaty?" Janine asks. Students attempt stifled answers and keywords are thrown about. Tino rangatiratanga, mana, kawanatanga. Janine emphasises that preemption was crucial to understanding how Māori had had their land stolen. She illustrates the notion through a story involving one student, who she nicknames Bob, and the boy next to him, Matiu. The students laugh as she describes the sale process between Bob and Matiu to the Queen and then the settlers, while discreetly slipping in that she won't get too activist at this point in time. The PowerPoint whips through other significant people and events through a dialogue of cause and effect. Donald McLean, the Kingitanga, a slide titled The Road to War. There's a lot of joking among students, so Janine rolls with the punches. Where was the best land in the world, she asks. Sweden, replies one girl in the back. Waikato, Janine shoots back, not missing a beat. Out comes a large map of the North Island from Vincent's book, The Waikato Wars, and the students come down from their shelf. Janine introduces photos of the main players in the wars to talk about how they were involved and where they were based, and takes the students down the construction of Grey's Great South Road. Now the students are really engaged and start to hunger for the stories that are about to come. "He came unstuck," Janine says, I think in reference to General Cameron. "What do you mean unstuck?" asks the student. "I'll explain this to you later," Janine responds, then adds, "You guys are getting warmed up." After the map activity at the museum, students are brought to a table where they're introduced to colonial objects from the Waikato Wars. The students learn about the stories behind each object and who they belonged to, then they get a chance to touch and handle each in turn. Janine dons white gloves and introduces each item. First a sword. "Yes, it's cool," she explains. "It's difficult." Next are handcuffs. "These handcuffs held Te Wahanui's mother. Te Wahanui was 6 feet 5 inches, so you can imagine that his mother was not a small woman. But these handcuffs are tiny. Look, see how small they must have hurt her. These are significant taonga for the descendants of Te Waharoa today. A Bible, a gun tin and a musket are the other items shown to the class. Another museum educator carefully demonstrates how the musket works and points to its many parts. Janine encourages the students to touch the objects, and she explains how they can really connect to the past, and it's rare to get this opportunity. Most of the students hold an item. Many take photos, but a few hang back. I notice looks of amazement at the gun, surprise at the heaviness of the cuffs, and a deep sense of respect emanating from the students. Once the objects have been handled, the students file into a bus to go to the first site. Janine and I travelled together in her car, and as we moved around the various sites, I learned all sorts of things about how she thinks about her practice. During our ride to the first site, she talks about how she guides students through difficult feelings experienced on the field trip. They come in, and the students are usually kind of, this is just going to be another school trip. Just going to get through it. And then they start to interact. And it took a long time for them in the museum. I had to warm them up. They're a pretty good age to do the wars with. I don't like doing the wars with anyone younger, to be honest. I don't mind year 11, 12, 13, and I do not really like doing it with intermediate school kids. They can't handle it. It becomes difficult for them. The main activity is the map, and then you bring them out here, and they've got all of this built up before you take them to the sites. I would never just take the class to the sites. I remember one group who said, "We'll meet you out there." And I said, that is not how I do it. Because I feel that the stories are lost on them if you do that. They just don't understand the gravity of it. That's a very difficult story and a really hard thing to listen to. And it's actually a story that deserves to be given some weight. You don't just rush through it. You don't just say, this was Rangiaowhia, this is what happened here, let's go to Ōrākau. You don't do that. In addition to thinking about the emotional state of groups of students, Janine talks about students who question and challenge the legitimacy of the atrocities that occurred at Rangiaowhia. She recalls one particular resistant student who would constantly try to prove her wrong. Now, I allowed him to do that because in him proving me wrong, he was accepting. He began to accept the story. So his thinking was like, wait a minute. And I'd speak to him more and more and in more depth and at more length. And he was an interesting kid. Yeah, I'll remember him because he was a questioner. Question, question, question. But yeah, they start off like that, quite apathetic. And by the end of it, it's very different. They're very different. You'll notice them. So this picture was taken at the first site we visited, the Catholic mission statement at Rangiaowhia. So in 2014, a po was erected by Ngāti Apakura to recount the invasion, and it was a powerful and moving moment to listen to Janine go down the po and recount Ngāti Apakura's perspective of the invasion through the images and symbols. So early in 1864, colonial forces led by General Cameron invaded the settlement of Rangiaowhia. Officials state that approximately 12 Māori were killed and a similar number were wounded, but the descendants of Rangiaowhia state that 100 to 200 Māori were killed. And what is particularly terrible about Rangiaowhia, as Arini has so beautifully already noted, was that it was a place of refuge for women, children and the elderly. It was an open village lacking fortifications or defences of its own because the men were nearby at Pāterangi Pā. And I watched and listened as Janine moved down the po and told the story. And at the end, she said, so that is a very brief account of Rangiaowhia, the Christianity, the beautiful garden, the prosperity, the invasion, the death and the children hiding in the rivers, and the people actually having to leave and to flee the place. That is confronting. And I told you this was going to be confronting. I told you this was going to be hard. This is hard to look at. It's not really pretty. It's not meant to be. It is put there for a purpose, and the purpose is for you to understand this place. Following the po, we drive to St Paul's Church. Janine talks about the vulnerability of the sites and how she hopes that building interest in the New Zealand wars will force a rethink of how they're presented and cared for. As if on cue, we arrive at the church and Janine lets out a big sigh. Oh, look at this. What did I say? Outside the front gate of the church grounds are 2 empty bottles. "Look," she says to the students, "we need to do better. This is a special place for all of us, and it's so important. Anyone can come here and burn this place down if they wanted." Janine waves the bottles and cans at the students to emphasise her point. "This is what happens because we are ignorant and don't know the history on our own doorstep. Now a law has been passed to teach our history so that future generations will understand the significance of this place." The second stop in the field trip is St Paul's Anglican Church in Rangiaowhia. Once the students and adults are seated inside, Janine explains that the church was built by the Christian Māori community in 1854 because they wanted a place to worship. Then she warns the students that the stories they're about to hear might be a bit sad and confronting for you, but I want to be very clear about something before I begin, and I will not tell half-truths. I will tell stories the way that I know them to be the truth. And they're the stories from the colonial European perspective, and they're the stories from the Māori perspective, which are the stories you don't always hear, and they might be the ones that challenge you a little bit. You are history students. You are young people who are now going out into the world and forming your own ideas and opinions about things. And you're taking them forward. You're sharing them with people. And you need to understand the importance of perspectives, okay? Janine begins by describing what Rangiaowhia was like prior to the invasion, a bustling, vital, growing town, and then gives some background about the events that led to the invasion, including the key people and places involved. In telling the colonial perspective of events, Janine draws on a written account by von Tempsky. Von Tempsky writes of a skirmish between colonial forces and the Māori. Māori are given the option to surrender, but say no. The soldiers become more and more irate and try to rush the whare, but get killed. In the meantime, a fire that had been set in a neighbouring home jumps over to the whare under siege. An old man in a white blanket emerges from the building home, and von Tempsky writes, "Spare him," is shouted by the officers and most of my men, but some ruffians and some men, blinded by rage at the loss of a comrade, fired at the Maori. The expression on that Maori face and his attitude on receiving the bullet is vivid before my mind's eye. That's when my heart grew sickened over the sight. When the first shot struck him, he smiled a sort of sad and disappointed smile, and then, bowing his head and staggering already, he wrapped his blanket over his face after receiving his bullet without a sigh and dropped quietly to the ground. Janine says that a dozen whare were burned to the ground, and she tells the students that they'll visit the site where this occurred at the head of the swamp. Next, this accepted version, or English perspective, is juxtaposed against the accounts of the descendants who survived at Rangiaowhia. Janine says, "Yes, von Tempsky is right. Yes, the men were getting very angry at not being able to get people out of the church, but they didn't dally around too long. They nailed the door of that church shut and they set fire to it. No, the fire did not come from the neighbouring whare. The church was set fire to, and how do I know that? Because in the letter in the museum, written by Trevor Drake, it says, 'We were at last obliged to set fire to the whare.' So he admits that that's what happened. It wasn't, 'Oh, the flames jumped the building.' That church was set fire to. Yes, the door was nailed shut. Yes, it was set fire to. And when that happened, there were a lot of people in the church. There were more than 8. So the Māori did the only thing they could do. 2 of the younger ones went to the back of the church and they started kicking out the back wall. Now, I've been told this by whānau of people who had ancestors there. This is their version. They started kicking out the back wall and they were able to kick through that thatch and make a hole big enough so they were able to pass through and maybe save some children and babies. What they did with them is they rammed them through the back of the whare to some horses and that the soldiers hadn't got to yet. They hid them and they were out of there. They tied those babies and children onto the horses and set them running. After the man came out with the blanket, there was no way that anyone could come out because that door was now shut. Nixon had been shot and the soldiers were furious, so they burnt them down. They just burnt it down with people in it, and that was war. That was acceptable to them because that's what they did. Finally, the students arrive at the site of great atrocity where the violence of the invasion had took full effect. down the road from the church at the head of the swamp where the village of Rangiaowhia had once stood. I feel underwhelmed by the presentation of the site, given the significance of what had happened here as recounted in the church. I stand on the triangular-shaped roadside verge with grass up to my knees and tilt my face back and feel the full weight of the sunny day. There's a loud lawnmower in the background and lots of birds. And I love the smell of cut grass, but snap out of my reverie at Janine's voice. Her tone is more direct than we were in the church, and it's lost that diplomatic edge. Instead, she directs the students to our shameful history and challenges them to be the change by referring to the actions of the youth at the Aotearoa College. Once Janine finishes speaking, the students are given some time for private reflection before the bus takes the class to Ōrākau. So when I get back to Wellington and transcribe the data, I consider how Janine had sensitively guided students through difficult emotions towards the violent realities of the invasion at Rangiaowhia in 3 parts. The first, Janine starts the day at Te Auckland Museum. She begins with a narrative of the Waikato Wars that are familiar to students. And then the standard narrative appears to provide a predictable and therefore emotionally safe entry point into the New Zealand Wars and some of the more difficult conversations that are about to follow. Then the students are taken to sites in which Janine conveys contrasting accounts of the invasion. Foregrounding the wars at the museum shows that Janine considered the emotional and cognitive maturity of young people and their readiness to really listen to previously silent stories and perspectives of colonial violence. Constant communication to students about the emotional labour of listening to violent and silenced perspectives of the New Zealand Wars occurred through the field trip and at different sites. And finally, the third part occurs at the site of colonial violence. Here, Janine aims to evoke a sense of responsibility in students to make choices informed by these histories to build towards a more hopeful future for all. And to do this, Janine is committed to giving a full account of the invasion of Rangiaowhia by strategically considering how to account for the difficult feelings that emerge from hearing these histories. And to do this, she had fostered intimate relationships with Ngāti Apakura, who entrusted her to relay their perspective with integrity. Thank you very much. That's the end.